Thank you. Hi, second home. I'm Rachel Bruhnke. I have been coming here ever since my baby was in diapers, and it's good to be home. Reverend John had just started when I started here, and I said, "Where do I sign?" And he said, "No, shop around a little bit." And I said, "Trust me, it's either here or nowhere." I was born a UU. Welcome to those of you who are new to this church, or maybe any church, and welcome my friends and everyone that we've known for so many years. I want to thank Kelly, who bravely took this on with me. I have a lot of slides. It's going to be very visual. I hope it works for you. I want to thank Leanne for doing all the hard work here, and for Chloe for allowing me to speak here today. Tracy for having the idea that my idea with Soren on having an open mic on the Cold War actually be a talk at this church. And to Jewel for the reading. And for the millions of victims of the global Cold War, who a Russian friend told me once he considered the biggest joke in history. A lot of us who follow the Cold War really don't think it ever ended, and it certainly was never cold from day one. I come at this talk from UU principles. Having been in this church for so long, that's kind of what guides me. Also, I've been in and around program all my life, 12 steps, family, known about it. Very principled way to live. And also in 1992, mostly because of our foreign policy, I left the Democratic Party and I joined the Green Party. And we have 10 key values, which help to lead me in a life that I try to have integrity with. So excuse me if anything I say today ruffles feathers or seems to disturb the peace. Actually, people like us are trying to make peace. And that's the issue with the propaganda, being constantly told that the peacemakers are the troublemakers. So my biggest, besides loving animals all my life, and community and world peace since a little girl, my biggest influence was my dad. He was a good-looking man, first of all. He was a Nazi hunter after World War II. His job was to tell a Nazi from a German refugee. And so I grew up with and was raised on a diet of anti-fascism and on a diet also of skepticism about what came after with the Cold War. Who was running the show in our country? Who was leading us into this Cold War? So the question is, how did we become more afraid of European-style socialism than European-style fascism? My dad always told me, Rachel, never forget. After the World War II, he came and he lived in New York during the 1950s. He says, Rachel, remember, the word was never communism. The word was godless communism. He said it was one word, and they used it to terrify the population, to create fear and loathing in the population. Around ideas that, looked at rationally, one could discuss and have differing opinions, but when you ratchet up the fear and loathing and the violence, it's impossible. You cannot attack. And it was an attack. It was a blitzkrieg of politics. So the next slide on FDR, my question, and again, how I came to question the Cold War. How was this idea of FDR's, the economic New Deal that seems obvious to us now, how is it almost law of the land, President of the United States, beloved, but his supporters pursued, vilified throughout the 40s and the 50s into this witch hunt, how does his ideas go from here to now Bernie Sanders, having very similar ideas, can't even get the Democratic nomination and is considered a joke? What happened in that 60, 70 years in our country to the psychology, the culture, the politics, the values of this country? So we ask ourselves, all the time, how is it that we're here? It has to be asked. Have you no decency? So as a high school student, I did a speech contest. It was not a peace speech contest, but I made it into a nuclear war contest. The title was You and I and Tomorrow. And all the rest of the high school kids, pranced along and did what they do. And I did what I did at 15, and I said, a blinding flash of white light, brighter than 1 million suns, 8,000 feet above the Empire State Building, and thus began my anti-nuclear war speech. And I circled the name, some of you old-timers know. One of the judges was Ed Hummel, a beloved member. Raise your hand if you remember Ed Hummel. Yeah, very good. And he was one of, I didn't see it until I saw this years later. I think I showed it to him before he moved away. So it's more relevant than ever today what we're talking about and the need to stop nuclear war. We are on the brink, closer than ever before. And if you're not confused, you don't know what's going on. The Cold War is confusing, it's controversial, and it never ended, and it never was cold. Of course, that statement was by Edward R. Murrow, war correspondent in World War II, who later became a correspondent in CBS, who later was blacklisted for his ideas. He was a beloved person in this country, later blacklisted by the Cold War. So he made this great movie. Some of you may see it. Maybe we'll show it, Kelly, one time. Great movie. Good night and good luck. Another great movie of mine that I remember is very influential for me was Reds in 1981. And later on, I read the book that he wrote, Jack Reed, 10 Days That Shook the World, really influenced me. Did a lot of reading after that, which is what people need to do. Paul Robeson, totally vilified, excommunicated, died a tough death. And he's a friend of our own Hope Foy, whom we laud and raise up here. And so I'm with him, not with him. This is an amazing book. Probably one of the main reasons I'm here. A conspiracy so immense takes you through the entire decade or so of the insanity that many of you, lived through. You're old enough to have actually lived through it. How is it that he could terrify such a brave nation as ours? We're brave, audacious people, and he cowered people into not expressing what they felt. How is it that he could take his message around the country, that HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, could go across the country, Kelly, across the country, spreading in small groups trials against people like us? We invite you afterwards, Soren and I, to have an open mic. How has the Cold War affected you? How has it belittled your values? How were you maybe threatened with a job? Whatever. What's your story? We invite you afterwards in the library. We invite you to tell your stories. And next, Nazi scientists here. How is it that after World War II, Nazi scientists get to come here to make missiles to point at an entire nation of anti-Nazis. We had to be kicked and screamed to join the fight against fascism. So to me, the Cold War is sort of like a Trojan horse that brought fascist ideas or allowed them to surface today. And we ask, how did we get to today? It didn't happen February, and it didn't happen in 2016. It's a lot before. So if you're not confused, you don't know what's going on. How can friend become foe so quickly? That communist hysteria, anti-communist hysteria, is today Russophobia. We can't hate our way into solutions. The sleep of reason produces monsters. This is one of my favorite paintings by Francisco de Goya. El sueño de la razón produce monstruos. We have to be reasonable. We have to be logical, rational. And we have to let voices share. Or else we produce monsters. Decades heading the FBI, so unconstitutional, so harmful to debate and to so many things in this country. And if he's an anti-communist, what am I supposed to think? If racial harmony is communism, I'm switching sides. Because George Floyd and the anger that brought up is still with us today. The peace and justice movements, trying to stop a war, trying to have racial equality, trying to have economic equality. All these people, targets. If these movements are targets, if anti-communism is what this is all about, it has a lot to answer for. Everyone in the country now celebrates MLK Day, right? How many murders at home and abroad? Always, almost always, the progressive left. If you could make a list, think about it, of the assassinations. It's all on our side. So this is an amazing book. Raise your hand if you know it. Labor's Untold Story. Glad to be sharing it. Thank you. If Chloe were here, she'd probably know it. She's super on labor. So this is a great book that shows me, a friend of mine, she said, look on page 15, the footnote. The footnote on page 15 talks about the politicians and the preachers in the 1850s. After the Communist Manifesto was written, 1850s, saying the problem with these abolitionists is that they're not just anti-slavery, they're communists and socialists. We've been red-baited for 170 years. So I started to act. I started the Cold War Truth Commission project. This was our first attempt. It was wonderful. It was at the First Synagogue in Los Angeles. And we had many speakers started it. And then a couple of years ago on Zoom, we had a 10-hour webinar called the Cold War Truth Commission, 45 speakers. The son of the Rosenbergs spoke. The son of exiled CIA agent Phil Agee spoke. Jeff Cohen, the producer of the Phil Donahue Show, spoke. And Daniel Ellsberg of the Pentagon Papers. And his conclusion at our Cold War Truth Commission is that basically the Cold War and the military-industrial complex in this country was a jobs program. It was to keep, and so much, the LA economy going. I'm going to show you a video from just 3 minutes, it's a longer video, of one of our speakers from the first year. Her name is Julia Scoville, and her family might be watching from Facebook right now. And she was 98 years old when we did this interview. She has since passed. She was a great member of San Pedro Neighbors for Peace and Justice. So Julia, I'd like to know, I know you were a nurse, that was your profession for many, many years. You became a nurse in the 1940s during World War II, but then after World War II, you had mentioned once that you were given a list by your employer of groups, a piece of paper with a list. Could you tell us about that story? What did your employer say to you about that list? What did he or she ask you?
Was I a member of any of these organizations?
And what did you answer?
I thought about it, and I realized, there was a witch hunt going on in the country, and I know I needed my salary in order to survive, and so I signed it.
You signed it saying that you were not a member of any of the organizations.
Yes.
But were you?
Yes, I was.
Yeah. And what kind of organizations were they?
They were usually organizations that were active. As I can remember, these were anti-racist groups who were supporting um, uh, people who were in poverty, especially young children. For me, it was like the census. It was included most of the people that I was interested in working with.
How did it feel when you had to sign something you knew wasn't true, but to keep your job? And these were all groups that you thought were important, humane groups.
It was really frightening, I think. They discouraged uh, a humane approach towards the problems of their fellow citizens.
During World War II, the Soviet Union had been our ally, and throughout the 1940s, there were so many organizations that you said tried to establish friendship between people in the Soviet Union and Americans. But then after the war, all that was changing, and you were all kind of seen as an enemy. Do you remember those times? Was that tough, that change in America?
Yes, because most of us, or many of us, have been working for justice and humane conditions and anti-poverty, and so this was difficult.
Yeah. Were you also at that time in the 40s working for racial equality?
Yes,
All of the organizations that you were made to kind of disavow. Do you think if those organizations had been allowed to continue working, as you say, for equality of the races and humane conditions for people, if all those organizations kept going, do you think America might be different or the world might be different today?
I could see it being very different.
So yeah, the world, we'll never know, but the world could have been a better place, perhaps without the intervention against all of these groups that you were a part of, Julia. And I thank you for being a lifelong fighter for the disadvantaged and for peace and for friendship among people. So, Julia, the point I think you're helping us make um, is that there were so many lies and injustices perpetrated. This is our own country, so we're talking about the United States, but in the name of the Cold War. And what we're realizing now in 2020 is so much of what you all were talking about in the 40s is now public consciousness in America. Racial equality, sustainability, peace between nations, really grassroots democracy that we're seeing burgeoning all over. And those were something that were your core values all your life. And now they're public consciousness, but we've been vilifying them for a long time. So it's our hope that through showing that the establishment in the United States has been trying to crush the left both at home and abroad, we're really doing the whole world a disservice. And I know near and dear to your and my heart is Latin America. You went to Nicaragua in the 1980s?
Yes, I did. I joined a group. It was a national-wide group of mostly young people who were sympathizing with the uh, attempts by a number of peace groups from around the world who came to assist Nicaragua.
Okay, and yet the story in the United States was told that they were communists, pretty much out to get us. Remember Ronald Reagan, may his name forever live in infamy, told us that the Nicaraguans could march here in 4 days if we didn't stop them down there. How? Yeah.
Well,
What did you see that the Nicaraguans were trying to do with their incredibly poor and unequal society?
there was a great need in the country, and I felt we could do something about it, and I would like to. And we weren't the only group. There were groups coming in to help uh, from all over the world.
Mm.
And at the airport, we'd meet groups from Australia and from uh, Europe and so forth.
Yeah.
And
And again, I think if the American, especially the American youth, knew, and this is part of our intention to get them to know, but if they knew about what we've done to Latin America in the past and currently what we're trying to do to Latin America, I think they'd be very much against it. And you have also been to Cuba, and you have impressions as a nurse yourself about the healthcare system in Cuba. What were your impressions of Cuba?
well, I was just so impressed with their effectiveness in gaining cooperation and uh, working with the patients. And the patients seemed to be happy. And I think we could learn quite a bit from the approach. I just felt that their approach was such that it had a great influence on people's improvement in their health care, in their health, and we could learn from them.
Much more of a public health approach and a holistic approach of the people.
Right.
Right. I took a professor of mine down to Cuba one time, Bob Gerhardt, and he's an expert in wastewater treatment. And being a nurse yourself, you understand that around the world, so many people die of dirty water. And so he said, I'll never forget, he said, Cuba's approach to water is exactly right. They approach the issue of water from a public health perspective. So number one, they really give importance to and resources towards wastewater treatment. And I've seen that across the island too. And you also went to Venezuela. You and your lovely daughter went to Venezuela.
Yes,
What was that like?
that was really, I guess, inspirational too. And although we went there to assist, we learned a lot ourselves from their approach to healthcare. And I think we should continue working together and help those that are in need and not be fighting and killing each other.
Nice. Well, I guess that's the two philosophies, huh? There's some of us, I think most of us, that want to help and cooperate with other people, especially those in need. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So the next slide shows Bob Farrell. He used to be our city council member. And he was also at our first Cold War Truth Commission. And he said something I hadn't really thought about. He says, you know, we realized there was so much picking off of the white people on the left that we looked around sometimes as black people and we lost our allies. And so it really put that black-white connection and people helping racial equality backwards. And today, the city council crisis, the crisis with black racism in the United States, in Los Angeles, racism against blacks, it goes all the way back. We can look at COINTELPRO here in Los Angeles. It's very important to get these voices out, the legacy in Los Angeles today. So Ronald Reagan shaped me. Here he is happily testifying at HUAC, House Un-American Activities Committee. Ronald Reagan in Central America was my Vietnam. Very, very foundational. We ask, how does the right-wing religion get so strong in America today? He invited in the front door of the White House, evangelicals and more godless communism talk. But, you know, not all religious people were allowed in the circles. Blaise Bonpane, speaking up for Central Americans, is a Maryknoll priest. He died a couple of years ago. The Jesuit priests that were killed, and the Cold War persecuted progressive religions and let the other extremist religions get stronger and stronger. I think you remember this picture of them. The 6 Jesuits and their housekeeper and young daughter were killed in El Salvador. Their murders set off a huge firestorm here in Los Angeles. I myself, I was a young woman, 22 years old. I got arrested 3 times, very proudly, with all the Latin American Solidarity people here. Latin America Solidarity, it can be considered a 40-year anti-war movement. Brian Wilson lost his legs. One of the founders of Veterans for Peace lost his legs trying to stop munitions going to Nicaragua. Brian Wilson, my first time at PUC was at a Nicaraguan event. This movie is maybe one of the best anti-war movies I've ever seen, Paying the Price for Peace. Guatemala, 200,000 people killed, mostly Mayans. Standing Rock is everywhere. It needs to be everywhere. My Peace Corps friends, when I used to be in the Peace Corps in Honduras, I thought, you know, we could be targets. The people, what we do is targetable in a crazy militaristic society. Next slide. My travels through South America make me question the Cold War. The 30,000 disappeared in Operation Condor in Argentina, and the CIA still gets to exist. And finally, go back one, please, Kelly. Finally, the Cuban kids. Going to Cuba helped me see a totally different Latin America than I had lived and traveled all throughout. Strong women, healthy kids, totally different. I'm not saying anywhere is perfect in any way, but I realized, I cried that first trip, and I realized 500,000 people have been killed in Latin America, all to keep them from being like Cuba and it wasn't okay. This speech that Fidel Castro gave in 1992, warning the world a generation ago on environmental destruction. And I question the Cold War for vilifying a country that screams about sustainability while we push catastrophic consumerism. So I take action. We're down here at the LA port saying that we cannot be occupying further Guantanamo base like we've been occupying for 110 years, and no one cares, no one thinks about it. It's just like LA Harbor. It's their second best harbor in the nation, and they haven't been able to use it for 110 years. The lies, the hypocrisy, the sleep of reason produces monsters, leading to another disastrous war. Shock and awe, putting bases in Saudi Arabia that led to the insanity of 9/11. And not just who did it, but who benefited. What has happened in the last 20 years in this country because of that? Can you see that whole thing? Raise your hand if you've seen, all the times we've seen this video, if you saw that sign. I didn't make this up. Okay, go look back at the videos. This sign at the top says, the true hidden enemy is communism. They don't care that they didn't win the election. That's not the point. They are raised in coups. We've all been raised in coups. A steady diet of fear and loathing. Militarism, Los Angeles economy. Our councilwoman just now is holding an event for youth in the military and how to recruit. When we have a climate crisis, that's what kids want to work on. Water, not wars. We're better than that. Our culture is better than that. Our science is better on that. I sometimes consider that we're some of the most oppressed people on the earth because there's so much goodwill in this country. There's so much possibility, and we're not allowed to let it happen. Militarism has been built up over 70 years in this country, and we could argue longer, and we must transition to peace. Our budget has to be better than this. It's a disrespect to ourselves who put our lives every day to earn that money. It's a disrespect to ourselves to tolerate this. And as a lifelong educator, I know kids would not approve of this budget. US military surrounding China. Obama's a pivot to Asia right after we got out of Iraq. We have to have something to do with the military. Why don't we pivot to peace? Why don't we transition, like we've been trying for decades, to a peaceful economy? NATO created 5 years, if I'm not wrong, Soren, after the Warsaw Pact, could have been dissolved after the Warsaw Pact, after the wall came down, but it wasn't. It has expanded. That's the point. There's a Medea Benjamin, Code Pink. She wrote an amazing book. They're on a national tour right now. Please read it. They're going to be here December 10th also in Los Angeles. My baby. Hi, honey. She might be in Scotland listening to me right now, and I'm going to wrap up. Obama did a lot of harm internationally, but his Cuba moves were good, and it proves that peace is possible. Imagine cooperation. Imagine a different response, even when we feel fear and loathing. Be the change. A lot of you recognize this yard. This is my home, Harbor Farms. This is how I try to be the change. The Cold War has done too much damage to the land, to the world's farmers and city folk worldwide. We must cooperate in peace, and I believe all this, and I have to ask you, ain't I an American? It's okay to question the Cold War. Thank you.